Dear colleagues, dear brothers and sisters, ambassadors, good afternoon, and allow me first, on behalf of the member states of the Group of Friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations, to give you, each and every one of you, a warm welcome to this important side event on the margins of the works of the Third Committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations during its 78th session. The objective of this side event, which is being transmitted live via UN Web TV, is to trigger a frank discussion amongst member states on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the full enjoyment of human rights, particularly on the realization of the rights to development and health, mindful of the fact that the General Assembly, as recent as a month ago, held 4 important meetings during the high-level segment of the General Assembly again, including one at the summit level on these important issues. For that purpose, we will be having a stellar panel of experts and academics on this critical subject that has a direct impact on over 1/3 of humanity in more than 30 countries around the world. We thank them for accepting our invitation and for being here with us, mostly via BTC. We are confident that their inputs will not only enlighten, but also further enrich our discussions on this critical subject. Similarly, we would like to express our appreciation to each and every one of you for joining us today, despite the multiple ongoing meetings at the various main committees and the plenary of the General Assembly. This is nothing more than a demonstration of your delegation's commitment with the very purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, as well as of your delegation's solidarity with the daily struggle faced by entire populations subjected to the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I will keep my remarks as short as possible, as the intention for today's meeting is to hear from you on your national assessments of the impact of unilateral coercive measures on the full enjoyment of human rights vis-à-vis the current global multifaceted crisis. Distinguished ambassadors, dear colleagues, unilateral coercive measures represent a serious violation of international law, as they disregard, among others, fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Given their wide impact on entire populations, and mindful of the fact that they seek to deprive individuals of their own means of subsistence, they are considered as crimes against humanity. The most recent report of the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of UCMs on human rights, from whom we will be hearing shortly, described the harms of secondary sanctions and the excessive application of these criminal actions on health and the environment, stating, and I quote, that they have a broad negative humanitarian impact globally, affecting a wide range of human rights of peoples living in countries subjected to any kind of sanctions, including those of a targeted nature, particularly those in vulnerable situations, disrupting, among others, trade relations and cooperation with those countries. End of quote. Unilateral coercive measures, whether of a political or economic nature, are meant to nothing more but to exert pressure on targeted states and force their sovereign will. This is a flagrant violation of the sacred principles of sovereignty and political independence as enshrined in the very UN Charter. Unilateral coercive measures constitute themselves into a deliberate attack against the right to universal health coverage and the right to development of the people subjected to them. They also create and aggravate the conditions for poverty and inequality in targeted countries, while undermining national efforts for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the attainment of the SDGs, as well as those directed at ensuring, once again, universal healthcare coverage, or at both preventing and better preparing for future pandemics. Unilateral coercive measures undermine the rule of law, particularly at the international level, and put unnecessary hindrances, among others, to financial transactions and payments between banks worldwide, which in turn affects the ability of targeted nations to legally carry out commerce and investment. Unilateral coercive measures are part of an inhumane policy of maximum calculated cruelty aim at generating the greatest possible pain and suffering on the populations subjected to them. So-called humanitarian exceptions are ineffective, as the Special Rapporteur on the negative impacts of UCMs on human rights has elaborated in previous reports she has presented both at the Human Rights Council and at this very General Assembly. These arbitrary, punitive, unjustified, and illegal measures constitute themselves, as said before, in crimes against humanity. Even more in the midst of the current international juncture, and given their wide scope, extraterritorial implications, over-compliance, and systemic nature, unilateral coercive measures are deliberately exacerbating the multifaceted crisis humanity is facing nowadays, and will continue not only to negatively impact global economy as a whole, but also to cause and prolong human suffering around the world unless a complete and immediate end is put to all these illegal measures that would then allow all nations to fully pursue their productive potentials and therefore contribute to the stabilization of global markets and the overcoming of current challenges. It is worth recalling in this context that in the recently approved high-level declarations resulting from the SDG Summit, as well as from the high-level meetings of the General Assembly on universal health coverage, on the fight against tuberculosis, and on pandemic preparedness, this crucial element was deliberately not included. This omission was primarily the result of pressures and intransigence from developed countries that still to date insist in minimizing, or even worse, in disowning the detrimental impact of this reality on over 1/3 of humanity. All of this begs at least two questions. The very first one would be why? Why to continue with this failed and anachronic policy that has resulted in nothing more than the pain and suffering of millions of innocent peoples around the world? And the second question would be when? When would the governments that insist not only in applying, but also in expanding these criminal measures understand that time has come for them to yield to the overwhelming calls of the international community for lifting once and for all these illegal measures? In the Venezuelan case, we have and continue to suffer firsthand the negative impacts of such a cruel policy. Our country is subjected to over 930 unilateral coercive measures, restrictive and punitive measures that have resulted in losses for over $232 billion. I repeat, $232 billion. In addition, they have provided a so-called legal framework for the looting of our assets abroad, amounting to over $30 billion, including over 30 tons of gold from our national reserves that were deposited at the Bank of England. That very same so-called legal framework has allowed for the IMF to deprive our country from having access to its legitimate and rightful special drawing rights within that institution. And here we emphasize, for instance, the urgency of advancing towards the long overdue reform of the entire financial architecture and its institutions, which to date respond exclusively to the interests of the developed world. To conclude, let me emphasize that unilateral coercive measures are not only illegal, but also inherently cruel and inhumane and thus immoral. Venezuela remains committed to shedding light on the detrimental effects that these criminal measures have on the realization of human rights, especially at present time, when we are witnessing a new generation and expansion of such illegal measures that are now crueler and much more destructive than ever before. Today, the entire Venezuelan people is unequivocally calling for the complete, immediate, and unconditional lifting of all sanctions arbitrarily imposed on our nation, while remaining determined to be a free, independent, and sovereign nation that will never yield to pressures or extortion from external factors or decadent powers with neo-colonial interests. I thank you all. At this stage, I would like to now give the floor to our panelists so they can make their presentations on this important subject. First, allow me to introduce a pre-recorded presentation from His Excellency Mr. William Castillo. Mr. Castillo is a Venezuelan journalist and a political scientist, Among the various positions he has held within the Venezuelan government, he has served as director of the National Telecommunications Commission, as well as president of both the Venezuelan Social Television and the Venezuelan Television, which are both state-owned public channels. He has also served as Vice Minister of Information and as Vice Minister of International Communication. Most recently, since September 2020, he has been appointed as Vice Minister of Anti-Blockade Policies, a position that he shares with heading the Venezuelan Anti-Blockade Observatory. Without any further ado, I now give the floor to Vice Minister William Castillo. Please.
En nombre del presidente Nicolás Maduro y del Gobierno de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, agradecemos la invitación a este evento cuya temática recoge una preocupación esencial: los impactos de las medidas coercitivas unilaterales sobre el derecho al desarrollo y a la salud. Desde 2014, Venezuela ha sido blanco de 930 medidas coercitivas unilaterales que han afectado severamente la actividad económica interna y el comercio exterior del país, así como el disfrute de los derechos humanos. Entre 2014 y 2022, el ingreso en divisas de Venezuela se contrajo 90%. La caída de la producción petrolera supuso una pérdida en ingresos de 232.000 millones de dólares. Debido a la caída del Producto Interno Bruto, la economía interna dejó de producir 642.000 millones de dólares desde 2015. La contracción, pues, de los ingresos públicos desarticuló el presupuesto nacional, reduciendo los fondos destinados al sistema de protección social, la salud y la educación, la seguridad social, los servicios públicos y los programas dirigidos a los grupos más vulnerables. Recordemos que Venezuela cumplió de forma anticipada los objetivos del milenio. Entre 1999 y 2012, el Sistema Público Nacional de Salud creció 400%. El país derrotó el analfabetismo y Venezuela pasó a ser el quinto país del mundo con la más alta matrícula educativa. La reforma social llevada a cabo por el presidente Chávez transfirió 20% de la riqueza de los sectores más ricos a las clases medias y pobres. Y Venezuela se ubicó entre los países con mayor desarrollo humano y en el segundo país del continente con menor desigualdad. Todo ello fue afectado por la asfixia económica producida por las sanciones. Las medidas de castigo colectivo a Venezuela, impactaron la prestación de los servicios de salud, deterioraron la infraestructura sanitaria, la atención y la cobertura, el acceso a medicamentos y forzaron la migración de profesionales del sector salud. A continuación, señalaré algunos hechos e impactos relevantes que demuestran la severa violación del derecho a la salud debido a las sanciones aplicadas contra Venezuela. El bloqueo a las cuentas y transferencias de Venezuela afectó, por ejemplo, la adquisición de vacunas para diversas enfermedades y vacunas para atender la pandemia del COVID, medicamentos antituberculosos, antimaláricos, insulina, antirretrovirales para el cáncer y para enfermedades crónicas y transmisibles tampoco pudieron ser adquiridos, hemoderivados y reactivos de laboratorio, equipos de hemodinamia para los niños con cardiopatías congénitas y equipos para hemodiálisis. A ello se sumó el retiro del país de 20 de las principales corporaciones farmacéuticas a partir de 2016, que afectó la producción y distribución de medicamentos en todo el país. Este conjunto de acciones sancionatorias produjo muertes por causas que se encontraban bajo control y muertes que pudieron evitarse. Entre los indicadores más afectados en el periodo 2017-2020 se encuentran la mortalidad infantil, la mortalidad materno-infantil, la prevalencia de diversas enfermedades y las muertes por padecimientos como cáncer de cuello uterino, diabetes, tuberculosis, sarampión, difteria y malaria, entre otras enfermedades. Se produjeron asimismo brotes de sarampión, difteria, hepatitis, sífilis y VIH. Un caso relevante ocurrió en 2019, cuando se paralizó una transferencia bancaria para adquirir 263.000 viales de vacunas multidosis, con las cuales podrían haberse vacunado 2.600.000 niños venezolanos. Otro ejemplo ocurrió en 2021, cuando en medio de la pandemia se bloquearon pagos por varios millones de dólares destinados a la adquisición de vacunas a través del sistema COVAX para vacunar a 20% de la población venezolana. A partir de 2015 se produjo un aumento desmedido de los precios de los medicamentos. Un medicamento vendido por una transnacional en Venezuela, por ejemplo, costaba 45% más que el mismo medicamento vendido por la misma empresa en Colombia. Entre 2012 y 2015, el número de medicamentos en el mercado farmacéutico privado se redujo 21%, mientras que el precio en dólares aumentó 65%. Las sanciones, pues, indujeron una crisis de producción, generando una caída de la producción de medicamentos hasta de 60% en la industria nacional en algunos rubros. Se produjo así una situación de desabastecimiento entre 2015 y 2018 que redujo la disponibilidad de medicamentos en más del 70%. El efecto más pernicioso generado por las sanciones lo constituyó la presión económica sobre el personal del sistema de salud, sin duda alguna. Debido a la crisis económica y la captación desde el extranjero, se produjo la salida de un grupo significativo de personal del sistema público hacia actividades privadas o hacia el extranjero. En los últimos 15 años, cabe recordar, se formaron en Venezuela más de 30.000 médicos, pero entre 2015 y 2020 el país perdió 30% del personal médico en general y entre 50 y 80% en algunas especialidades críticas. A partir de 2018, mediante el esfuerzo del gobierno bolivariano, se logró incrementar los fondos dirigidos al sector salud, reduciendo los casos y muertes evitables en mujeres y niños, así como las causadas por enfermedades transmisibles. Al día de hoy, octubre de 2023, se evidencia una recuperación de los indicadores de salud y una progresiva normalización en la prestación de los servicios en todo el país. No obstante, el daño causado a la capacidad de atención del Sistema Público Nacional de Salud es multidimensional. Su recuperación será compleja y se extenderá en el tiempo. Los hechos ocurridos en Venezuela ratifican sin duda alguna que las medidas coercitivas unilaterales constituyen un delito de lesa humanidad. Son acciones ilegales e inhumanas que atentan contra el derecho a la salud y el desarrollo de Venezuela. Es, por tanto, una tarea ineludible seguir luchando por el levantamiento total de las sanciones en el mundo y por el levantamiento definitivo del sistema sancionatorio contra la República Bolivariana de Venezuela.
Agradezco al viceministro, I thank Vice Minister William Castillo for his much valuable presentation. And at this stage, allow me now to introduce another pre-recorded presentation from Professor Alina Dohan, who is currently the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. Professor Dohan is a professor of international law and the director of the Peace Research Center at the State University of Belarus. She is also the author of over 150 books and articles on various aspects of international law, as well as of over 40 publications related, among others, to human rights and sanctions. Professor Dohan, the floor is yours.
Honorable Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Permanent Mission of Venezuela and the Group of Friends of the UN Charter for organizing of this side event, focusing on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the full enjoyment and realization of the rights to development and health, which is very important and timely today, especially in a view of the SDG summit, which took place in New York in September to seek for ways to adapt the 2030 agenda. And I regret that this topic has not been included in the agenda or the final document of the summit. Discussion of the impacts of UCMs on the SDGs achievement took place in Geneva in September this year at the biennial panel discussion, and I hope that that event, as well as the event taking place today, will help to raise awareness on the problem and to protect human rights in the future. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, my country visits thematic work as well as information received from various sources on a daily basis clearly indicate the detrimental impact of unilateral sanctions and over-compliance with them on the achievement of all and every single SDG, affecting therefore the right to development and well-being of all those living in targeted countries, regardless of the types of unilateral sanctions imposed. The healthcare system as a whole is highly vulnerable to the imposition of unilateral sanctions and to related zero-risk policies due to the deterioration they cause in people's standards of living, high inflation, and severe disruption in the purchase, payment for, and delivery of necessary medicine, medical equipment, spare parts, reagents, or software. Overcompliance by businesses prevents access to medicine even in the actual absence of comprehensive or sectoral sanctions. Even with established humanitarian exceptions for medicine and food, businesses are often reluctant to provide medical services or sell medical goods due to the vague or overlapping sanctions regulations. Deliveries may be obstructed or delayed due to financial restrictions, including exclusion from SWIFT of targeted banks or countries, freezing of central bank assets, sanctions imposed over transportation and insurance companies, threats with secondary sanctions, requests for multiple licenses for procurement, transportation, or insurance, even for delivery of humanitarian assistance, imposition of civil or criminal penalties for dealing with countries under sanctions, zero-risk policies by third country banks and companies. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, growing mortality rates, reduced life expectancy, rising prevalence of physical and mental health conditions and disabilities due to lack of timely diagnosis and treatment, as well as growing physical and psychological suffering, are only some of the serious tangible consequences in violation of human rights, such as the right to life, freedom from torture and inhuman treatment, and the principle of non-discrimination. Numerous medicines and equipment not available in specific countries due to overcompliance with sanctions regimes, as well as types of diseases which can't be consequently treated, thus resulting in early and often painful deaths. The latest report I presented to the Human Rights Council in September 2023 provides numerous examples of the unavailability of specific medicine, medical equipment, and medical services in every specific country under sanctions. Imposition and implementation of unilateral sanctions and zero-risk policies violate numerous international treaty and customary obligations of states, including obligation to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and freedoms in accordance with the UN Charter, provisions of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Convention on the Rights of Child, and many other, including ILO conventions and standards on labor and occupational health safety. Such measures constitute unilateral coercive measures inadmissible under the international law and give rise to international responsibility of sanctioning states. Claims about the unintended character of the adverse humanitarian impact on the right to health of unilateral sanctions and of overcompliance, and references to good intentions do not legitimize any such conduct. The burden of proof of the legality of any unilateral means of pressure lies on the states and organizations which impose them. Enforcement of unilateral sanctions and overcompliance prevent countries from any possibility to exercise fully their obligation to guarantee the right to health within all available resources due to the scarcity of such resources, undermine national efforts towards strong and reliable healthcare systems, and constitutes violations of the right to health by sanctioning states. Similar responsibility arises when states do not take all necessary measures to ensure that businesses acting under their jurisdiction or control do not violate directly or indirectly human rights, including the right to health. I have already stated that humanitarian carve-outs, which often cover medicine and certain medical products and equipment, appear to be ineffective and inefficient, even if we seek to implement humanitarian provisions of the UN Security Council resolutions. Humanitarian deliveries are often challenged due to unilateral coercive measures and overcompliance. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, unilateral sanctions and overcompliance have a detrimental impact on implementation of all aspects of the right to health for all those living in countries under sanctions, including access to adequate medicine, healthcare facilities, medical equipment, access to qualified medical assistance, prevention and control of diseases, scarcity of health professionals, access to health facilities, training, and access to up-to-date scientific knowledge, technologies, research, exchange of good practices. It's not less important that unilateral sanctions and overcompliance also affect all relevant underlying determinants of health and factors: right to adequate food, freedom of movement, elimination of poverty, access to clean water and sanitation, electricity, fuel, economic and labor rights, right to a favorable environment. Women, girls, children, persons with disabilities, people suffering from rare and severe diseases, older persons, and socio-economically marginalized groups are the most vulnerable in the face of unilateral sanctions. People become isolated from international cooperation and can hardly rely even on the delivery of humanitarian aid due to the reluctance of donors, medicine and food producers, and insurance and delivery companies to engage with such countries, which prevent them from enjoyment of fundamental human rights. These elements clearly demonstrate the challenges for the achievement of all SDGs, and each of them can be elaborated to and deserves special and detailed discussion. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, as a special rapporteur, I strongly believe that if we look for the solutions to enable the countries around the world to achieve SDGs and the right to development correspondingly, the above-mentioned challenges should be taken into serious consideration. Impact of unilateral sanctions shall not be ignored when discussing the achievement of SDGs alongside other challenges. Assessment of the impact of unilateral sanctions shall be done by all relevant UN entities, country teams, and other international organizations within the scope of their mandates. People from the countries under sanctions shall not be discriminated and deprived of their right to participate in, to contribute to, and benefit from social, economic, cultural, and political development. The most obvious way, already reflected in multiple reports of the UN Secretary General, is to respect the rule of law by all public and private actors, to act in conformity with the principles of cooperation, solidarity, due diligence, and humanity. As all the more active use of unilateral sanctions and overcompliance demonstrates, sanctioning states and organizations complying and enforcing banks and businesses are not willing or sometimes are not able to do it. In this case, I believe it's very important for the UN and its specialized agencies and national offices to play their role in monitoring of humanitarian impact, also within the sanctions monitoring tool being currently developed by my mandate, to ensure that humanitarian terminology and principles are implemented properly without any manipulation, and that critical needs of people all around the world are met and are not undermined by the use of unilateral coercive measures and overcompliance. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Professor Dohan for her much valuable and enlightening presentation. And I would like now to welcome Dr. Mohamed Marandi, who is joining us via BTC from Europe. As many of you know, Dr. Marandi, a survivor of the effects of two chemical attacks during the 1980s, is an Iranian-American academic and political analyst. He currently serves as a professor at the University of Tehran, where he headed the North American Studies Program and the World Studies Center. He has appeared as political and social commentator on various international networks and has developed an expertise, among others, on questions relating to the impact of unilateral coercive measures, including in the health sector. He was also an advisor to the Iranian nuclear negotiating team that concluded the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action back in 2015 in Vienna. Professor Marandi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening, sisters, brothers, friends, and comrades. Before, I used to think that maybe through enlightening Western journalists and Western government officials, it would be possible to change their views with regards to the sanctioning of nations, millions of people across the world, hundreds of millions of people across the world. But watching the scenes in Gaza make it more difficult for me to believe that this is ever possible. The fact is, however, that sanctions have such a broad effect on societies that it is impossible for someone like me to explain. Families are destroyed when factories are shut down. Men become depressed. Women become depressed when they have a sense of hopelessness with regards to the future of themselves and their children, when they have difficulty purchasing food, when they have great difficulty finding housing, when they have no jobs. In addition to that, medicine in a country like Iran, which is wealthy because of its natural resources and because of the capability of its youth and its educated class, the sanctions in a country like Iran have basically prevented ordinary people from being able to sometimes purchase very important medicine. Sometimes factories in Iran are unable to purchase the raw materials needed or the machinery needed to produce medicine in the country. And then suddenly there's a huge shortage of a particular type of medicine. Sometimes the medicine that's not produced in Iran cannot be imported in time. Why? Because the banking sector itself is shut down. So drug companies, pharmaceutical companies demand money to be paid to them, but Iranian government institutions, government ministries, companies, private companies find it impossible to get the money to the pharmaceutical company fast enough for Iran's needs to be met. And as a result, many people die. And then after a while, a new series or a new group of medicines we face shortages with regards to those. So it's a constant cycle. When one day one particular medicine is not available, 2 months later, a different type of medicine is not available. When Corona struck the country, Iran had roughly $7 billion in its accounts in South Korea. This was due to this money, the fact that Iran had exported natural gas or gas itself and oil to the South Koreans. The Americans ordered the South Korean government to withhold Iran's assets, causing a series of problems. But when Corona hit, the Americans prevented Iran from even purchasing masks, purchasing test kits. Later on, they prevented Iran from purchasing vaccines. And then they also prevented Iran from purchasing the equipment to produce its own vaccines. Imagine at the height of Corona, the psychological impact that it had on the nation, let alone the sheer number of people who died as a result. The companies that tried to import the machinery and the equipment to produce vaccines were all sanctioned. In other words, the American government was seeking out companies that were trying to help create a vaccine for the Iranian people at the height of Corona. In addition to that, purchasing food becomes more difficult for the government and more expensive. Purchasing everything becomes more difficult. And sometimes the Iranians, they purchase key supplies But since they have to send them through means that are not usually used, the wealth of the Iranian people is stolen or frozen by these pharmaceutical companies or other companies that are engaged in trade with Iran. One of the most disturbing scenes in the country is when young patients, cancer patients, or patients that need transplants, they are halfway through their medication and then the medicine is not available or their needs cannot be met. And parents who spent so much money for the survival of their children become desperate and ultimately lose their child and lose their wealth. I hope that my sisters and brothers, my friends and comrades and colleagues can push to bring about change so that Western regimes in particular refrain from bringing about so much suffering across the global South, and especially in Gaza today. Thank you.
I thank Professor Marandi for his much valuable insights and presentation on this subject. And now I would like to welcome Mr. BJ Prashad, who is also joining us via BTC from Boston. BJ Prashad, a US-based Indian historian, journalist, political commentator, and intellectual, currently serves as executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Mr. Prashad is the author of over 40 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, and The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power, which he wrote together with Noam Chomsky. He's also the chief editor of Left Word Books and the chief correspondent for Globetrotter. BJ, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. My name is Vijay Prashad. I am the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research with offices in Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo. I am grateful to the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter, and in particular to the permanent mission of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for this invitation. My institute, Tricontinental, has spent the past 8 years closely studying the impact of unilateral sanctions, looking closely at the laws around these instruments, and looking at their impact on the societies that have been sanctioned. Before I begin to present some of our thinking on these issues, I want to say that it is hard to focus on anything, really anything, while this cruel genocide takes place before our eyes in Gaza. That more Palestinian children have died in these 3 weeks due to the Israeli bombing than have died in total in conflict zones across the world since 2019 is shocking. No child should die so cruelly before they can flourish, neither due to this incessant bombardment, nor by the hunger induced by unilateral sanctions. There is no easy way to define sanctions. When a conflict arises between countries, any measure short of war belongs in the category of sanctions. Sanctions could be diplomatic, withdrawal of ambassadors, for instance, or economic, barriers on trade. Even though sanctions are not like bombs, their impact can be as lethal. Several questions emerge even with this basic definition. Who gets to determine when a country poses a danger or deserves to be sanctioned? How does one differentiate between extreme economic sanctions and armed conflict? Is not a complete embargo tantamount to a declaration of war? In this modern world, these questions are to be adjudicated by the United Nations. The UN Charter is the legal document that binds countries in the General Assembly and in the Security Council to consider cases of conflict and find measures to settle disputes or to pressure countries to reconsider their course of action. The text in the UN Charter is Article 41. And I'm sorry, I'm going to read it out because many people seem to have forgotten it. Here's Article 41. The Security Council may decide what measures not involving the use of armed force are to be employed to give effect to its decisions, and it may call upon the members of the United Nations to apply such measures. These may include complete or partial interruption of economic relations and of rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other means of communication, and the severance of diplomatic relations. There are several important points raised in this article. First, it is the Security Council that is given the authority to decide on a course of action based on the Council's understanding of events in the world. Second, it is the Security Council that acts based on this interpretation. Third, Article 41 provides a list of possible tools to be used, but suggests that these are not comprehensive. Each member state of the United Nations must have faith in the Security Council if this procedure is to work. Sadly, the UN Security Council is not a perfect representative of world opinion. 5 of the 15 seats on the Council are held by permanent members, a custom put in place to give a veto power to the 5 winners of World War II: China, France, Russia, the UK, and the United States. These 5 countries have been capricious with their use of the veto. Veto power by 5 permanent members undermines the Security Council's democratic aspirations. Pressure by powerful countries, particularly the United States, has limited the Security Council's ability to appear as a neutral arbiter. Furthermore, the United States has, outside the UN system, exercised a sanctions policy in a unilateral manner. These US sanctions are not conducted through a discussion in the Security Council, nor have they any international credibility. In fact, US sanctions are illegal. They are a violation of the United Nations Charter and of a range of international treaties. The impact of these sanctions is grotesque, and it has been documented by the United Nations and by the various human rights groups. Attempts to create so-called humanitarian carve-outs do not have the intended impact. In fact, rather than humanitarian carve-outs, the evidence suggests overcompliance with unilateral sanctions. These carve-outs do not work since they are provided on a case-by-case basis and are used as quote-unquote rewards by the illegal party that implements these sanctions. Since these unilateral sanctions are illegal, they need to be banned rather than accepted and then moderated with carve-outs. What is important to bear in mind is that the unilateral sanctions have undermined the ability of the sanctions countries to meet their important obligations to the Sustainable Development Growth Agenda. The world needs peace. The world needs development. The world does not need war. The world does not need poverty. The world does not need despair. The world certainly does not need unilateral coercive sanctions. Thank you very much.
I thank you very much, dear BJ, for your thoughtful and interesting remarks. We concur with you on many of those. And now, last but not least, I would like to now give the floor to Mr. Elias Amare, who is also joining us via BTC from Boston. Mr. Amare is an Eritrean journalist and geopolitical analyst and was also the former editor of the publishing houses of Red Sea Press and Africa World Press. He's also a founding member of the Asmara Bey's Peacebuilding Center for the Horn of Africa. At present time, he is active in research and advocacy activities for the National Council of Eritrean Americas. Elias is also a Pan-Africanist, deeply interested in the progressive vision of the New Horn of Africa vision. Without any further ado, Mr. Amare, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. First, on behalf of the National Council of Eritrean Americans, I would like to extend our most sincere gratitude to the Permanent Mission of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and a group of friends in defense of the UN Charter for giving us this opportunity to present the case of our people, the people of Eritrea, against US imperialism's sanctions, blockades, and unilateral coercive measures. The use or threat of use of force against any country, big or small, is a violation of the UN Charter and international law that should be condemned. These US sanctions against Eritrea are a form of aggression, economic war really, meant to inflict pain and suffering on the Eritrean population. As such, these sanctions or unilateral coercive measures are a gross violation of human rights and crimes against humanity. The question is often asked, why these sanctions against a small country like Eritrea? Why such violence and hostilities? At present, the US unilateral coercive measures is aimed at over 40 countries, mostly of the global south. So why these sanctions? We may find a partial answer to these questions from official US policy paper entitled Integrated Country Strategy on Eritrea, which was published in March of this year, 2023, at the US State Department official website. The litany of baseless accusations peddled in the policy document defy reason and establish diplomatic norms. In many respects, the policy document accentuates the visceral and unwarranted hostility that US policy-making circles have pursued for decades against Eritrea, purely and simply in order to advance their perceived global interests at the expense of a sovereign nation. The policy document announces for the first time that the US has indeed been pursuing, quote, since September 2021, US National Security Council endorsed policy of disciplined confrontation with the Eritrean government. Indeed, the policy document unabashedly announces our, quote, our primary strategic policy goal is to cultivate Eritrea's next generation and prepare for a post-Isaias regime. Isaias being the president of Eritrea, His Excellency Isaias Afwerki. The policy document enumerates the inventory of illegal unilateral sanctions that various US administrations have imposed on Eritrea in the past 2 decades. The vicious cycle of adversity was triggered by and set in motion when first the Clinton and next the Bush the son administration chose to change the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission arbitral award to mollify their client state, then the minority TPLF regime in Ethiopia. It's currently ousted from power, in violation of international law and the explicit provisions of the Algiers peace agreement brokered by the US itself in conjunction with the European Union and the African Union in the year 2000. That's over 23 years ago. Eritrea then rightly refused to play ball and sheepishly compromise its sovereign rights. This aroused US ire and subsequently led to the spiral of hostile acts that ensued in subsequent years. As it happened, the US leveraged its diplomatic clout at the UN Security Council in the year 2009 and subsequently in 2011 to impose wide-ranging sanctions, including an arms embargo, precisely at a time when large swaths of Eritrean sovereign territories were occupied by Ethiopia in violation of the Algiers Peace Agreement and international law. The pretext for these US engineered sanctions at the UN's Security Council were totally baseless lies that Eritrea helped the Al-Shabaab terrorists in Somalia. Never happened, and was later proven to be utterly false, and a manufactured border crisis with Djibouti, also another lie. But the global hegemon, the US, has the ability to maneuver and engineer such sanctions even at the UN Security Council. The US and its allies further unleashed a vicious policy of strategic depopulation to wean Eritrea's youth from the national service and arduous tasks of nation building by systematically granting blanket political asylum in their countries to all Eritreans in the fall of that fall in these categories. Allow me briefly to say, under the UN sanctions, the UN Security Council sanctions that were imposed on Eritrea, they were strictly an arms embargo. But then the hegemon can maneuver through its hegemony of the global banking system to block any kind of essential trade and transaction. For example, the purchase of tractors from a European country, over 100 tractors, was blocked. The purchase of water pump for use of small-scale farmers by the government of Eritrea was also blocked. The purchase of chemicals, Eritrea has a modest pharmaceutical industry, chemicals for drugs such as malaria tablets, essential antibiotic drugs, and other medical medicament for communicable diseases, tropical communicable diseases. This purchase of the chemicals essential for the manufacture of such drugs was also blocked. We here in the United States raised funds to send computer tablets to Eritrean schools, particular to schools in the remote area to boost the library system. But again, the cargo transfer was blocked, and a roundabout route had to be secured. So it is these kinds of, the pretext is often brought that this could be somehow used for dual use or military purposes, and such, such measures, such pressures are used to intimidate companies from concluding the transactions, legitimate legal transactions. Also, because of the dominance of the dollar and the SWIFT system, the sending of remittance by Eritreans is also another way of blocking the economic development of the country. And that's the current trend of de-dollarization, because countries are getting fed up of this type of coercive measures. Well, to continue furthermore, the US administrations invoked spurious pretexts to harass Eritrea by leveraging various instruments in their toolbox of illicit unilateral sanctions, as I have mentioned before. In this web of lies and vilification, Eritrea was and remains ranked as Tier 3 for trafficking in persons due to its mandatory indefinite national service, quote unquote. Eritrea has also been, quote, designated a country of particular concern for international religious freedom. This is weird because Eritrea is a highly pious country of religious pluralism with centuries-old Abrahamic faiths that live in exemplary coexistence and harmony. Both Christianity and Islam were introduced peacefully to Eritrea in the 3rd and 5th century by peaceful means, and the two religions coexist side by side in harmony. So it is weird to say Eritrea is a country of particular concern of religious freedom. And in the wake of the TPLF's war of choice and insurrection in November 2020, the Biden administration also invoked what it calls the Global Magnitsky Act to impose unlawful and unilateral sanctions on the Chief of Staff of Eritrea's Defense Force. Furthermore, and as odd as it may sound, the Biden administration dubbed the war in northern Ethiopia as constituting, quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, end of quote, prompting President Biden to declare a national emergency and thereby enact Executive Order 14046. As it happened, this instrument was principally used to, quote, sanction several Eritrean entities and individuals. This list has not been published as yet. In this act, the US has concocted a spurious rationale precisely in order to whitewash and absolve the TPLF's crimes of war and insurrection and target Eritrea for its act of legitimate self-defense and regional stability. The US policy document also contains various operative paragraphs on and reference to Eritrea's legitimate ties with China, and to some extent Russia, as well as lamentations on Eritrea's voting pattern on the most contested issues, quote unquote, in the UN General Assembly that do not kowtow to US positions. For example, Eritrea's vote recently in support of the ceasefire and humanitarian aid for the people of Gaza, with the Palestinian people with whom we stand in solidarity. In this vein, it alludes to Eritrea's accession to, quote, the Belt and Road Initiative, its hosting of Chinese foreign mission Wang Yi in January 2022, China's maintenance of a relatively large embassy in Eritrea, and even scholarships that China has offered to Eritrean students, end of quote, in the past years. These presumptuous postulates are too trite to merit serious response. Eritrea is not a client or vassal state of the United States. It has every right and indeed duty to cultivate ties with all nations in our global community on the basis of mutual respect and common benefits and interests. Indeed, Eritrea's sound international and regional policies and the ties of friendship and cooperation that it cherishes to nurture with all countries is anchored on these normative parameters. The US policy document does not only fail to acknowledge these normative variables of foreign policy, but goes further to speculate that, quote, an Eritrea strategically aligned with China could deny the United States access to a large part of the most valuable shipping route in the world and increase China's foothold in the Horn of Africa, end of quote. This speculative assertion is not only utterly false, but reeks of US strategic considerations and arguments in the 1950s for subordinating and compromising Eritrea's legitimate national rights on the altar of US global hegemony. Eritrea's responsible conduct in safeguarding maritime traffic to all nations as a littoral state in the Red Sea is otherwise a matter of impeccable track record. On the wider North African Middle Eastern operational theater, US wars of destabilization in Libya, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, etc. are well known and these days openly admitted by various circles within the US establishment. In the event, to point an accusatory finger against Eritrea is really disingenuous and morally vacuous. Eritrea has, for its part, explored all avenues to restore normalcy to its bilateral ties with the United States to no avail. And for reasons better known for itself, the Biden administration has reverted to and ratcheted up the adversarial ties of the past decades. In the event, the malaise lies in US misguided calculus and policy choice of flouting international law and the norms and practices of diplomatic ties between sovereign nations to advance its narrow geopolitical interests and to impose these baby killer sanctions. To return To the earlier question then of why Eritrea has been sanctioned, it is simply because Eritrea is Eritrea's unwavering commitment to genuine independence, pursuing independent political and economic development path, rejecting being subservient neo-colonial vassal nation to the US imperialism, that Eritrea is being punished through these unwarranted and unjustifiable sanctions. As Eritrea's President Isaias Afwerki noted in his recent address to the BRICS summit in South Africa, the tiny few aside, the lofty aspirations of humanity as a whole are for a just and fair global order where justice and the rule of law prevail, where nations and peoples forge meaningful and symmetric ties of cooperation and partnership on the basis of respect for national independence and sovereignty, for societies anchored on compassion and social justice. End of quote. Thus, our optimism of the will forged in the long struggle confirms to us that such a new, just, multipolar global order is indeed emergent and nothing can stop it. Thank you for hearing about the suffering of the Eritrean people and their courageous, resilient, and defiant struggle for independence, social justice, human dignity, and against these so-called sanctions or unilateral coercive measures, which are nothing but crimes against humanity and gross violations of human rights. Thank you for your solidarity.
I thank Mr. Elias Amare for his presentation. And at this stage, moving on with our program, I would like to now open the floor in order to initiate an informal and interactive exchange amongst participant delegations. Is there any delegation interested in taking the floor at this stage? I recognize the distinguished representative of China. Ambassador Dai, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, at the outset, I would like to thank Venezuela for organizing this important event. I also thank all distinguished panelists for their insights. The topic of this meeting couldn't be more relevant. The detrimental effects of UCMs to the right of development and the right to health are well documented. UCMs prevent targeted countries, including those present in this room, from acquiring essential goods and services, sever their linkages with the global economy, and create big obstacles for the realization of the SDGs. During the pandemic, UCMs stripped or restricted access of many states to vaccines, diagnostic tools, and other medical interventions, and led to serious consequences for countless innocent people. In accordance with the relevant UN reports, the implementation of the 2030 Agenda has been slowing down, and many SDGs is off track. Many factors contributed to this, and the use of the UCM is by all means one of them. During the high-level week of the UN General Assembly this year, many world leaders, especially those from Global South, called for more resources for the SDGs, and the Secretary General even called for a SDG rescue plan. But at the same time, the imposing states refuse to lift UCMs, clinging to UCM as a handy tool, and even expanding the scope of its regimes in total violation of the UN Charter and the general principles of international law. We must continue to fight against the UCMs for a simple but strong reason: to protect people's well-being, retrieve chances of development being robbed, and safeguard the principles and purposes of the Charter. Here, and finally, I would like to share a few insights. First, we should continue to shed light on the unlawful nature and devastating impacts of the UCMs and called for immediate lifting. China has been taking every opportunity to do this in UN organs, either the Security Council or General Assembly. We have taken the lead in delivering the joint statement on UCMs for the past 4 consecutive years and are happy to see the sponsors of the statement increased this year. Second, we invite more partners to join the push for concrete actions. UCMs creates many obstacles for humanitarian operations. With expanding UCMs regimes, there is growing concern over the use of UCMs in humanitarian community. Many humanitarian organizations have been working silently behind the scenes to elevate the negative impact of all sanctions, including UCMs. We hope the humanitarian organizations can be more vocal in this regard, and China stands ready to work with them. Thirdly, we should continue to create an enabling environment for development. Adequate support from member states, the UN system, and other international organizations should be rendered to the sanctioned states to elevate their difficulties. We should further South-South cooperation, such as the BRICS, promote necessary reform of international financial institutions to the benefits of global South, and share developing opportunities and outcomes with each other, so as to boost development and build up resilience. China will continue to support developing countries through Global Development Initiative and Belt and Road Initiative. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of the People's Republic of China for his remarks. And now I recognize the representative of Iran, Mr. Mohsen Ghaneh, First Counselor and Director for the Office of Developments and International Human Rights Treaty Bodies from the Foreign Ministry. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I want to start my official intervention, I would like a humbly request through you, Mr. Chair, that in the name of the thousands innocent children who massacred in Gaza and who were under the sanction for many decades, request the esteemed member of the GOP stand up and keep 1 minute silent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. Chair, Excellency, colleague, distinguished panelists. At the outset, I would like to thank the Venezuelan mission to holding the critical meeting, as well as the Madam Elena Dohan, the Special Rapporteur, for her insightful statement and hard work. Islamic Republic of Iran reiterates its categorical rejection of the legality of proposed unilateral coercive measures in all of its form, manifestations, and the form of extensions for compliance with them. The Islamic Republic of Iran is one of the view that imposition of the any unilateral coercive measure runs contrary to the goals and the principle set forth in the United Nations Charter and flagrantly violate international law, international humanitarian law, and the norm and principle of the governing peaceful relation between the nation and the crime against humanity. In the practice, the application of the measure of such nature weakness of the rule of law, world order, and the national solidarity and multilateralism. Mr. Chair, undoubtedly, the imposition of the unilateral coercive measure and the sanction that encroach upon human rights, some of which, such as the right to the life, is of the jus against nature, constitutes a flagrant violation of the provision of international law and has no legal standing whatsoever. The imposition of a UCM and the consequence, therefore, including the need to bring back the situation of its previous state and compensation for damage, entails international responsibility for states. Compliance with unilateral coercive measures systematically as a serious threat to the human rights and dignity of the people is targeted countries violated of human rights of the women, children, youth, those with disability, elder person, those with severe and the rare diseases, refugee, migrant, and those living abroad but are dependent on the critical goods and services inside the country and therefore amounts to the collective punishment. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Negative Impact of Unilateral Coercive Measures concluded at its visit in May 2022 on Iran by highlighting the complex set of unilateral sanctions against Iran, coupled with the secondary sanction against a third party over compliance and zero-risking policy by the business and financial institutions, which exacerbated humanitarian and economic challenges, including those resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Chair, human rights that will be violated by the unilateral coercive measure range from the right to the life, health, movement, access to the technology, and humanitarian assistance to the right of development, among others. Human rights are interdependent and indivisible. It is obvious that the imposition of unilateral coercive measure with any purpose whatsoever has negative impacts on all components of human rights. Those imposing measures of such nature cannot claim that they have no impact on the human right or impact therefore are limited to the rights such as the right to the health, the responsibility of which they can abdicated by the issuing so-called humanitarian license. The unilateral coercive measures have direct and indirect impacts on the realization of our state ability to realize human rights. Unilateral coercive measures over compliance that their life-threatening impact included but are not limited to the delivery of a specialized life-saving medicine and medical equipment or in the transferring money for medical operation to or from the countries under sanction and challenges in academic research and cooperation in this area. Mr. Chair, for instance, in Iran, there are recurrent reports of the deaths of the people suffering from EB, that the epidermolysis bullosa, owing to the overcompliance by the relevant producers. EB is a rare skin disorder involving a number of related health complications that suffering can only reduce by the appalling specific bandage. There are also the numerous other examples of the reluctance foreign companies to deliver essential equipment for the healthcare sector, such as ambulances and the medicine, medical equipment, and the necessary spare parts. We have similar cases regarding the patient with thalassemia, cancers, and diabetes. Furthermore, during the pandemic, unilateral coercive measure posed many obstacles to the supply of equipment, medicine, and vaccine needed to deal with the COVID-19. Mr. Chair, on the right to development, I would like to seize the opportunity and highlight that the importance of today's timely discussion as we prepare to end the marathon for adoption of international covenant on the right to development that began in Geneva. The unilateral coercive measure and the sanction imposed against the targeted countries undermine their ability to attain objectives set out by development program, and the major obstacle created by them compromise the concerned country's ability to fulfill their relevant obligation in this era. Therefore, Iran fully supports the adoption of a legally binding document in this regard, which addresses the negative impact of the UCM in the fulfillment of the right to development, so as to meet equitably in development and environment needs for the present and future generation. There is a significant proliferation of the sanction by United States and the European Union. According to the report of Madam Special Rapporteur, United States sanction use has increased by 130% between 2000 and 2021. This is without counting other restrictive measures, such as visa restriction and export controls. The unilateral coercive measures are basically engineered and exacerbated inequality gap in the target country. UCMs are mean of political extortions and coercions. It is imperative that, Mr. Chair, in conclusion, the entire United Nations system condemns exacerbation of the illegal unilateral coercive measure imposed by United States of America and the European Union against a sovereign state, including my own. Islamic Republic of Iran calls upon the United Member States, especially the orchestrators of such inhuman and illegal measure, those complying therewith, as well as the commercial companies and the business, to lift all the unilateral coercive measures immediately and with no delay, and looking for an effective mechanism to compensate for the damages caused by the unilateral coercive measures in the targeted state and the victims therein. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his remarks, and I now recognize the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of Nicaragua. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Joaquin. We would like to express our appreciation to the delegation of Venezuela for organizing this side event of our group, as well as to the panelists for their accurate information on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measure on the full enjoyment and realization of the rights to development and health. We need to hold with more frequency these kind of events in order to raise awareness and solidarity among our membership at the United Nations. Our world is rapidly advancing towards multipolarity with irreversible trends of political, social, and economic integration among brotherly countries and peoples. This new multipolar world order is based on the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, which the Western imperial powers seek to ignore by imposing unilateral, illegal, coercive, and arbitrary measures against peoples and governments exercising their right to national sovereignty, independence, and self-determination. The peoples of the world have the full right to advance in the constructions of our own model of political, economic, social, and cultural development according to our history and national identity, free from foreign interference or intervention, threats, or aggressions. However, we are witnessing how the development and progress of our countries and peoples is hindered by poverty, the economic and environmental crisis, and by the energy crisis, inflationary and global food crisis caused by coercive unilateral measures imposed by colonialist and imperialist countries on our peoples and developing countries, preventing us from achieving our goals of fighting poverty, obstructing the right to development of our peoples, and the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. Health is also a right that should be exercised in its totality by all the peoples of the world and without exclusions of any kind. The most recent COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the selfishness of the aggressor countries by hindering the international cooperation and solidarity that was required so that our peoples could face an unprecedented pandemic. They conditioned access to vaccines, treatments, medical equipment, and supplies, as well as professional services. This same imperialist, colonialist, and neo-colonialist mentality continues to be evidenced around the world, including at the United Nations, where a few weeks ago we witnessed the individualism and oppressive pressures of Western countries to reject and block the inclusion of the negative impact of UCMs in extremely important political declarations such as the Sustainable Development Goals Summit and 3 declarations on health issues. It is urgent to eliminate these UCMs and replace them with projects of integration, cooperation, and solidarity in order to overcome the many challenges that we face as international community. In the face of these persistent aggressions against our peoples, Nicaragua will not cease in its denunciation of the end of these sanctions. Our call to strengthen unity, solidarity, to confront these illegal policies in violation of international law, the Charter of the United Nations, and the full enjoyment of human rights. I thank you, Ambassador.
I thank the distinguished Ambassador of Nicaragua for his remarks, and I now recognize the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, distinguished Chair, Ambassador, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. Russia's negative attitude towards the practice of applying sanctions as a tool of pressure on sovereign developing countries is well known. Such politically motivated actions breach fundamental human rights and freedoms, generally recognized norms of international law, while undermining the efforts of states to resolve crisis situations, and have been repeatedly condemned in numerous UN General Assembly resolutions. We proceed on the assumption that normally sanctions should be a last resort measure applied exclusively with the approval of the UN Security Council in order to eliminate a real threat to international peace and security. We must not allow situations where unilateral coercive measures turn into a mechanism of collective punishment and negatively affect peoples and whole countries. Equally unacceptable is the use of unilateral coercive measures as an instrument of unfair competition in order to clean out from the market reliable but related to so-called unfriendly nations, private companies. Of particular concern is the phenomenon of so-called secondary and tertiary sanctions, which are a means of extraterritorial pressure in order to ensure primary illegal coercive measures. Such actions give rise to the phenomenon of overcompliance with the UCMs, or so-called chilling effect, including from business structures, financial institutions, and humanitarian partners, which further aggravates the negative impact of such measures on human rights. We regret to note that the use of the so-called secondary sanctions has increased recently and spread to almost all spheres of society, including sports and culture. They therefore lead to a sharp deterioration in the socio-economic situation of large sections of the population. And measures of administrative and even criminal prosecution that complement them actually made these measures an instrument of blackmail and intimidation. The consequences of these illegal sanctions were clearly felt by Russians living abroad as part of the campaign of aggressive Russophobia launched by Western countries last year. Not only students and those living in Western countries, but also citizens of Russia, sportsmen and people of art suffered. We support the recommendations made in the report by the Special Rapporteur, which are an important contribution to the study of the UCMs phenomenon and countering it. Importantly, during the SDG summit on September 18th, 19th, and the three General Assembly high-level meetings on health that followed, our heads of states and ministers respectively reaffirmed their commitment to the ideas contained in the 2030 Agenda, with a view to its full implementation. In this regard, we were deeply disappointed by the adoption of the filing documents of the mentioned event without mentioning reference to paragraph 30 of the 2030 Agenda included in their texts, which is the call for refraining from promulgation and applying of unilateral coercive measures. It is obvious that the development of many states is blocked not as much by the widely discussed multiple crises, but the illegal unilateral measures in question, especially extraterritorial ones, aimed at depriving people of their basic rights to development and health. However, we once again appreciate the efforts by the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter and other like-minded delegations that over this year and in more concerted manner have contributed to raising the profile of the issue of UCMs being explicit means of coercion, and also look forward to our further coordination at the upcoming negotiation tracks, including the Summit of the Future and others as appropriate. We also call on the UN development system to engage in a more systematic and bold manner in the monitoring of the impact of the UCMs as mandated by the relevant GA resolutions. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation for his remarks, and I now recognize the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Allow me to express my delegation's appreciation to Venezuela, the coordinator of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, for your able leadership and your tireless efforts in coordinating the activities of the group and for organizing this important side event. I wish also to express our profound appreciation to Professor Dohan for her dedication in exposing the negative impact of UCMs and her commitment to build a body of knowledge and empirical data on this important matter. We also like to reiterate our support for her 2023 report, which highlights the adverse impact of secondary sanctions and overcompliance on human rights. The theme of this side event is pertinent in view of the global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it exposed the state of unpreparedness at national, regional, and global levels for health emergencies. UCMs have significant and wide-ranging impacts on the health sectors of targeted countries. They severely limit access to health care, trigger brain drain, and hinder scientific and medical research by restricting access to research funding, collaborations, and the exchange of knowledge and technology. UCMs are a gross violation of the right to development of millions of people in targeted countries. They impede their efforts at addressing the current interlinked global crisis. In the case of Zimbabwe, the sanctions have negatively impeded government's efforts to improve the livelihoods of its people. We therefore call for the immediate and unconditional lifting of all UCMs on targeted countries, which including Zimbabwe, to enable them to achieve SDGs. We concur with the Special Rapporteur on the need to cooperate in instituting empirical studies on the costs of the UCMs, organize symposiums on the illegality of UCMs, and carry out scientific studies on the linkages between sanctions and their direct and indirect impacts on ordinary citizens. In conclusion, my delegation would like to express our appreciation to the Special Rapporteur and the distinguished panelists for their insightful and vital contributions in the fight against the illegal and unwarranted sanctions. We call upon the progressive world to join us in calling for the unconditional removal of these heinous measures in order to live up to our mantra of leaving no one and no place behind. Thank you, Chairperson.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe for his remarks, and I now recognize the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, we'd like to extend our gratitude for His Excellency, Mr. Joaquin Perez, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Mission of Venezuela, for convening this meeting. We are always here, either to attend a meeting, cooperated or organized by Venezuela, or to listen to a statement prepared and built by Venezuela as well. So we really thank the Venezuelan mission and their team for all their efforts since the foundation of this group. Wish also to thank Ms. Dohan for the participation and valuable briefing, along with His Excellency Mr. Castillo, and all the panelists that I thank them for joining us today. And since the subject of this meeting is of a highly importance for Syria, allow us to make the following remarks. We have supported the mandate of the Special Rapporteur ever since its establishment. Under the agenda of Third Committee at the GA, we have a little bit over 65 Special Rapporteurs for various topics. The mandate of the rapporteur, Ms. Dohan, on negative impacts is simply the most important for Syria, not only because Syria is currently under sanctions, but also because of our firm position in rejecting the principle of mass punishment, aiming at depriving the people of the right of freely choose their political and economic system. Last year, we had the honor of the visit conducted by Ms. Dohan to my country, Syria, to study the impact of UCMs on enjoyment of human rights for the Syrian people and the right to development, especially after the illegal imposing of the so-called 2019 Caesar Civilian Protection Act by the United States, which led to putting the country under a catastrophic blockade. In a glimpse to the report, over 90% of the Syrian people are currently under the poverty line, due to the inhuman US and EU sanctions, along with the state of prohibition of the most needed reconstruction process for political reasons. My delegation reiterates two very important points. First is the necessity of the immediate and unconditional lifting of all UCMs imposed on Syrian people and other developing countries in a violation of the principles of the UN Charter. Second, the collective pledges to ensure promotion and protection of human rights, including the right to life and the right to development. For the time for understanding, action, and solidarity is here. Let us engage in unity as a group to help each other to overcome the negative impacts of UCMs. We can forge a path towards a more equitable and prosperous world for all. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his remarks, and I now recognize the representative of Belarus. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues and friends. We're grateful to the delegation of Venezuela in their capacity as the chair of the Group of Friends in the defense of the UN Charter for allowing us the opportunity to address this crucial issue that affects millions of lives worldwide, the negative impact of UCMs on the right to development and on health. This topic calls for our urgent attention as it touches upon the very essence of human dignity, of well-being and of progress. Unilateral coercive measures are a neo-colonial whip to force disobedient nations into compliance with the world-sized plantation. While ostensibly targeting governments or specific entities, it is in ordinary citizens who suffer from these measures the most. First and foremost, UCMs severely hinder economic development. By limiting a country's access to international markets, financial services, and technology, they stifle economic growth and cripple the ability to invest into critical sectors such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. This translates into reduced opportunities for employment, lower income levels, and increased poverty rates, directly impedes the full realization of human potential. Furthermore, the right to health, as articulated in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, guarantees everyone the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. However, UCMs disrupt the health infrastructure of targeted countries. Medical supplies, including life-saving drugs and equipment, become scarce, leading to inadequate healthcare provision and undue suffering. Vulnerable populations, including children and elderly, and those with chronic illnesses, are disproportionately affected. In addition, sanctions exacerbate existing inequalities when the most vulnerable segments of society are left to bear the heaviest burden. This creates a vicious cycle as the erosion of basic services and economic opportunity deepens poverty and inequality, which further enhances the socio-economic divide. Moreover, sanctions can have long-lasting and intergenerational effects. Children growing up in countries subjected to sanctions faced reduced access to education, proper nutrition, and healthcare. This not only jeopardizes their immediate well-being, but also hinders their future prospects and perpetuates the cycle of poverty. It is our belief that diplomacy, dialogue, and encouragement and engagement should be prioritized over punitive measures that harm innocent civilians. And our use of the word civilians here is not a coincidence, because as some of the member states used to justify UCMs, they called them, and I quote, a useful non-military response to grave violations of international law in crimes against humanity. End of quote. In conclusion, we believe that the issue of UCMs should remain an integral part of International Covenant on the Right to Development, which has already been mentioned here, and which will soon consider, negotiate, and subsequently adopt. We also commend the creation of the database on UCMs by Special Rapporteur Professor Dovgany, which will help us all document the real impact of UCMs on human rights, including in the areas of healthcare and socio-economic development. We also believe that more academic institutions in the targeted countries need to start researching the impacts of UCMs, feeding their analysis into the database and establishing a network of experts in the relevant fields. Also, we need to render every assistance to the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of UCMs on the enjoyment of human rights, support country visits, and provide the necessary data and resources for the mandate. And finally, we must advocate for policies that prioritize human dignity, equality, and well-being over short-term political gains. By doing so, we can move forward to a world where every individual truly has the opportunity to thrive and no one is left behind. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus for his remarks, and I now recognize the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, let me at the very outset thank the organizers for convening this timely discussion. We would also like to thank our panelists for sharing their expert views on this important issue. The humanitarian impact of unilateral coercive measures is enormous upon lives and well-being of millions of people in targeted countries, in particular women, children, and persons with disabilities. They affect all categories of civil, economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to development. The COVID-19 pandemic has made the negative humanitarian effects of unilateral sanctions more obvious and more disastrous. UCMs, including sanctions, have a detrimental impact on national health systems of targeted countries, depriving millions of people of their fundamental right to health. We have witnessed that many targeted countries were unable to purchase life-saving medical equipment and supplies, including ventilators, oxygen masks, CT scanners, test protective kits, and faced obstacles in procuring softwares for e-health and telemedicine systems because of the rejection of transactions between manufacturers and targeted states and companies, the reluctance of banks to permit bank transfers, or the enormous extension of transfer terms due to the fear of secondary sanctions. This has overwhelmed public healthcare systems of targeted countries, leading to an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. We would like to reiterate that unilateral coercive measures and legislations are contrary to international law, including international humanitarian law, UN Charter, and the norms and principles governing peaceful relations among states. If the international community wishes to have an inclusive recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, it must call upon imposing countries to withdraw all unilateral coercive measures voluntarily and unilaterally from targeted countries. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for her remarks. Is there any other delegation interested in taking the floor at this stage? That does not seem to be the case, but before concluding this segment of our event, I would like to give an opportunity to our panelists, as some of them remain connected via BTC, in case they may want to quickly react or perhaps share some concluding remarks as a wrap-up to this discussion. You will have some 3 to 5 minutes top at this late stage of the event. I recognize first Mr. BJ Prashad. BJ, are you there?
Yes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come back after all the distinguished members of the different delegations have spoken. My feeling is that we are in a very difficult time in the world, an unbalanced time with at least 4 conflicts ongoing, some of them with no end in sight. For instance, the war on the poor. Poverty rates around the world are increasing, despite the fact that we have a glorious example of the abolition of poverty in the People's Republic of China. There is the ability that people have to transcend poverty, hunger, and so on. But the major powers of the world, led by the United States, seem to believe that the solutions to our problems lie in war and in sanctions. $2.3 trillion was spent on weapons last year. 75% of that spending came from NATO states, especially the United States. 75%. That money, that incredible amount of money could be spent instead on helping us get beyond climate change, helping us get beyond poverty, helping us get beyond hunger. The answer to our dilemmas of humanity are not in war. They are not in sanctions, particularly not in illegal coercive measures. The answers to our problems are before us. We have the resources, we have the technology, we have the innovation to solve the pressing problems of humanity. And yet the United States seems to believe that the only answer is to war. That is precisely an intellectual debate that I think one needs to have to convince the billions of people around the planet that the answer is not through war, is not through sanctions, but it's through the conscious application of our resources and a conscious application of our ingenuity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, dear Vijay. I now recognize Mr. Elias Amare. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I recall that recently an international people's tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and unilateral coercive measures composed of distinguished scholars, legal international lawyers, human rights lawyers, and academicians such as Professor Vijay Prashad, heard from 15 countries, including my country, Eritrea, that have been victims of these so-called sanctions, unilateral coercive measures. For 9 months, from January up to September, and at the end of the hearing, extensive hearings, it passed the resolution, the jury passed the resolution condemning this unilateral coercive measures, UCMs, sanctions, as amounting to genocide and crimes against humanity. So this is an important legal tool to fight with. I hope the group of friends in defense of UN Charter take up on this and bring it to the UN General Assembly, because we can no longer, the world can no longer tolerate this flagrant violation of human rights, crimes against humanity, and genocide, because that's what they amount to in the end. Oftentimes when I'm in the media defending my country's fight against these sanctions, I call them baby killer sanctions. I refer to you will recall that the the late former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, once, I think in 1996, in an interview with CBS journalist Leslie Stahl, when Leslie Stahl asked her that according to UN report, the sanctions imposed on Iraq were killed as a result of that. 500,000, 500,000 babies died. And Leslie Stahl asked her, were these sanctions worth it? And Secretary of State Albright, with stone cold face, said, yes, we believe they're worth it. So they know that these sanctions kill babies, millions of victims, but they impose them because the intention, these sanctions, the intention is to inflict pain and suffering on the populations of, in particular, the populations of the global South. And thus, this is nothing but economic warfare, and as the International People's Tribunal declared, their genocide, crimes against humanity, and this fight, I think, needs to be taken further. I recall to you also that the African Union also condemned through recent resolutions the imposition of these unilateral coercive measures on 3 African countries, my country Eritrea, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe, from whose ambassador we heard. And thus, the international community, the real international community, is in outrage against these unilateral coercive measures and condemns them as such. If there was fairness and justice in the world, those imperialist powers who are imposing this should have been facing trials such as the Nuremberg trial. Crimes against humanity are being committed. And thus, this is very important that the group of friends have organized this side event to highlight the suffering of those countries, such as Eritrea and others. Over 41 countries are facing these sanctions, the suffering, and bring it to justice. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Amare for his closing remarks, and I thank all of the panelists who stayed with us throughout this event for their incredible presentations and insights on such a critical issue that has an impact on over 30 countries around the world that encompass over a third of humanity. I guess there are at least three takeaways from these remarks that we have heard today. The very first one is that change is needed, and that change is needed now. The world does not need more unilateral coercive measures. The second one would be that the answer to the challenges and to overcoming the differences that exist between nations, and that is very normal in the world we live in, it cannot be to impose or expand the application of unilateral coercive measures. And the third one is that embargoes and unilateral coercive measures can indeed be compared to declarations of war. The impact of unilateral coercive measures, as has been expressed not only by the panelists, but by many of those who took the floor today in this meeting, can be comparable. It's as lethal as to the impact of weapons used in conventional wars. And then my last point at this stage as a takeaway and wrapping up this discussion we had today, looking forward, is that there is a sort of urgency to include this as a top priority in all our discussions in order for this issue to be adequately redressed and that we can finally see an end to the application of unilateral coercive measures. And perhaps here at the UN, with all that we do, we have a window, we have an opportunity coming shortly when negotiations on this covenant on the right to development start now here in New York within the framework of the General Assembly. That is a very important space in which we need to make sure that there is a specific reference to the impact, the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures. As we have said in the past, and we insist in saying it all over again, unilateral coercive measures are a deliberate attack on the right to development. With that, and before closing this side event, once again, I would like to thank all the panelists for their presentations and comments, as well as delegations that participated in today's event for their much valuable contributions. For our part, rest assured that the member states of our group of friends in defense of the Charter of the UN remain committed and will spare no effort in raising awareness about the negative impact of UCMs on the full enjoyment of human rights, on the attainment of the SDGs, and on fostering a global community of development with a shared future, while insisting on their call for the immediate, complete, and unconditional lifting of these illegal, cruel, and inhumane measures. I thank you all very much for your participation. The meeting is adjourned.